of addition to the purchase agreement, then escrow, will populate the amendment, right? And the amendment is, after both parties, the buyer and the seller, come to the agreement, have executed the addendum, then the amendment to reinforce that agreement is done by the escrow company. Okay. So items included in addition, attachments, or supplement, and the amendment items included a change, modification, and or revision. So why was the amendment created? Historically, most forms to be signed by sellers and buyers were called an addendum, other than the purchase agreement, including extension of time addendum. And there's many forms that utilize one part, and then it says an extension of or an agreement of the addendum. The purchase agreement is one of those elements that performs, thank you, these set agreements between the principals, right? The buyer and also the seller, including the extension addendum, the backup offer addendum, the additional signature addendum, short sales addendum, and the addendum in general itself. These are just a few of many of the contracts that we see of the addendums and amendments. Problem after a binding contract: when a principal signs an addendum, the other party did not always sign immediately or at all. The party who signs the addendum could not be sure if the new terms were being agreed to or not, and creating uncertainty. So Steve, let me ask you this question.
Yes, sir.
Many years of experience, licensed real estate broker, instructor, and really engage in understanding the purchase agreement and all the forms that we have, right? When do you see these addendums typically come up?
Well, the addendum actually can come up right from initially writing the offer.
Right.
Because if you think of an addendum as an additional part of the contract to elaborate, since our contract itself, the RPA by itself, does not allow for a lot of lines initially to be written. Even though I think we just recently changed that with the text overflow, I will acknowledge that.
Right.
That was just a recent change. But if there is you have a set of circumstances that needs real elaboration, right in the initial offer, you're able to then include an addendum right with the initial purchase agreement, and you say subject to the attached addendum number 1, or RPA addendum number 1.
Right.
And that is probably the very beginning of where an addendum can take place.
Right.
But once there is an accepted offer between buyer and seller, any change to the price and or terms that then have been agreed upon between buyer and seller, at least initially verbally, has to be then memorialized in writing. And that is done through the addendum. And then via the addendum, it is then memorialized one step further into the escrow amendment.
Yeah, spot on. Thank you. Yeah. And if you look at the purchase agreement, it defines two components, right? It says the residential purchase agreement as defined, but it also includes the escrow as well, right? Because it coincides to the agreements that, the buyer and the seller come to an agreement, right? Price, terms, and condition. The reflection from the escrow is, being a third party company, they're a neutral to this. Their instructions will follow based on what the principals are requesting. And most, but not all, of the information is gathered from the purchase agreement or emails asking or requesting, right? Because we can go into, a request to repair, right? And that request of repairs can also be something that we may have to add an addendum because the buyer is asking very specific terms or specific requests to the seller, or vice versa as well. So to distinguish one from the other in creation, it's like Steve was saying, is the importance to start the addendum, which typically is done by agent to agent, and then that gets sent over to the principals to sign and agree to those terms. And then once that is executed, then that sends out to the escrow company. The escrow company will do what's called an amendment, and really just securing that everyone is in the same page. So this is one that you were just talking about, Steve. Why was the amendment created, right? The amendment of existing agreement terms, CAR Form AEA, was created to minimize uncertainty. So here's a sample of that form itself, which I believe was created back in 2020 or 2021, if I remember correctly. I think there's a date on there. But it gives you some perspective, because what the addendum doesn't do that the amendment of an existing agreement does, it gives you an expiration. And why is an expiration very important and very valid, right? Because there's times that the seller or the buyer is not responding to these types of requests. So this is the reason this form was created, to give time of the essence, but more so a time to get a response. Otherwise, if it doesn't get a response, then it immediately expires. Now, and this expiration is no difference than your purchase agreement, right? Which is how many days, Steve? Expiration.
The default is 3 calendar days.
3 calendars, yep. And this one in particular is by 5 p.m. So if you are submitting an amendment of existing terms signed by either the buyer or the seller, this creates the timeline to get a response from the opposing party. And if we don't get a response within the 3 days by 5 p.m., then this basically becomes an expired void agreement.
It's a totally new document that I haven't seen.
Really?
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
you're referring to a CAR amendment.
Ah.
I was thinking you were making reference to escrow amendment, not a CAR amendment.
Yeah, well, too. Let's go
Yes.
I don't need to review that form.
Yeah, I definitely.
It was just created in 2020?
2021.
Or so right at the time of the revision of the
Right.
revised RPA.
The beauty of this this particular form, Steve, it gives you that parameter, which is right here, right? I know it's hard to see from your angle, but it gives you number 2. Because typically the amendment, or excuse me, the addendum, just it's all lines, right? So you can fill in as whatever you want or with the request of your clients, right?
All right, so now you would use the amendment if the situation that was being called for now called for an agreement that possibly was in dispute between the two parties, or really wasn't absolutely confirmed, you would actually then put it on the amendment versus the addendum.
Correct.
To truly allow that tightness of the essence factor.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because remember, the addendum doesn't have an expiration date.
Right.
You can send that, it could be days and weeks before you get a response. This kind of just focuses on, let's get to, what our terms are, what we're requesting, but we want to know as soon as practical, which is the 3 days, which is an awesome form to have, especially if we're representing someone that is asking for some type of request. Yeah.
Right. Typically, you would almost see that almost in the request, in the response of a request for repairs, probably most often.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. Very cool. Let me admit someone else to come in. All right, so.
Hi, Simon. It's Christine. Hi. Can the gentleman that just said something, I couldn't hear him. He was too far from the mic. Something about when you would use it.
With my voice, you gotta be
Right.
yeah.
See, that means you got to come up closer.
I mean, I could hear parts of it, but I felt it was something important that he said, because I haven't used this. I do a lot of the addendums, like you're saying, but I get it with this, with the time period.
A new form, again, I was thinking when he was talking about addendums versus amendments, I was thinking he was making reference to escrow amendments, not CAR amendment form. Okay, and so, but typically what I was saying is typically you would almost see it probably used more often when time is of the essence, and every addendum by nature of itself is already time is of the essence, but this already has a built-in deadline response built into this addendum. But most likely you would almost see this if you're worried about a response maybe from a seller, typically on a request for repairs. Okay. Right. If you're probably going back under the request for repairs, and you're probably ping-ponging back and forth a couple of times, then possibly you may want to put the last response on an addendum with a time frame, because then it does allow, especially if you're representing the buyer and the buyer now also has the time sensitivity of having to remove the investigation contingency, it allows them that ability to then quote back out on the basis of the lack of response and not having a meeting of the minds.
Yeah, no, well said. Thank you, Steve. I hope you were able to hear that, Christine.
Yep, all good. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay.
Miss you, Simon.
Yes, likewise. Miss you too. All right, so let's continue. So the form AEA, the first line in the form identifies as a proposal whose terms are specified in paragraph 1, right, which is this section here. Now the form, paragraph number 2, provides the proposal like an offer or a counter offer expires automatically unless accepted by the other party as specified in time defaulted, as Steve said, 3 days after it's signed. If receiving a party takes no action, the proposal terminates and the terms of the contract remain unchanged. No more uncertainty. So basically, here's the pros and cons. Obviously, you want to get a response. The sooner you get that response, the better, right? But it allows the time up to 3 days. Now, you can reduce that time as well and says, hey, I need to get a response within 24 hours. Or you can also stretch it where he says, okay, I don't need to get a response immediately. We're okay with 5 days to get a response because we know that the seller may be on vacation or in a remote area and they're not going to be able to get this on a timely manner. You know this because you're in communications with the listing agent, right? Then to put, we'll allow 5 days, 6 days to get a response, but it gives you a concrete expiration date, and that either we move forward or we ultimately revise it, change it, or we decide to cancel this agreement. So when to use the addendum versus the agreement, right, which is this form, the AEA form. An addendum is generally intended to be attached to the offer or any other documents as a supplement, right? When we submit an offer and then we have to do some changes to it, after doing back and forth counter offers, because typically we'll send an offer, the seller will send us either a multiple counter offer or a seller counter offer. And then you'll respond to either the acceptance or the buyer says, well, I'm still not really happy with the price. Let's go ahead and send now a buyer counter offer number 1, right? And you're now back and forth. That's typical. Usually you don't use addendums in that phase of negotiations. It's really after you have the agreed upon, right, executed agreement between the buyer and the seller have mutually agreed to the terms. Now you're in escrow and now you're going through the motions, right? Price, terms, and conditions. But during this process, there may be a hiccup. There might be something that we need to add. This is the distinguish in the intent of the addendum is to be an attachment to the offer as a supplement. Okay, we're supplementing because there's not enough space that we need to be very detailed, and especially in our industry, right? We want to make sure we're concise in our point across, and that there's no confusions, right? Because sometimes I've seen it, Steve, you've probably seen it as well, that, you know, you kind of scratch your head a little bit and realize, well, you know, it sounds this way, but it doesn't make any sense, right? Yeah, Steve.
But also a distinction to really make sure you understand is addendums, even when initially writing offers, aren't only for the buyer's agent. It's also for a listing agent as well, to be used also with a counteroffer. I'll give you an example. I just had one last month. I was a listing agent, in which then I issued out a multiple counteroffer as well as individual counters after initial rounds of negotiation. Where because the property was in default, the property was also had a lis pendens against it. It had there was attorneys involved that approval of any offer was subject to the review and approval. That I made the counter offers, okay, subject to or having addendums to the counter offers as the listing agent. So it's not just only a buyer's agent potentially using an addendum with the initial offer. You can and should, when needed, also include an addendum rather than trying to cram it all in those few little lines. Again, in real estate and real estate contracts, more is better. The more specific you can be rather than trying to abbreviate because of you feel like there's limiting lines. We have no limiting lines in writing our contracts, and the addendum gives us that ability.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. Thank you. The ability of a text overflow, you know, how many times have we, you know, written information on one of these specific zip forms, right? And it's like, we're running out of space. Well, the cool thing about the zip forms, it allows you to have what's called a text overflow addendum. As I stated, there's many variables to this addendum, right? And this is one in particular, which gives you the concise documentation to continue adding the language that you need to be, as Steve said, very specific on what the terms or what your buyer or seller is requesting. And the text, the text overflow, believe it or not, you won't find it on zip forms.
No.
You know, you can type TOA, you're not going to find it. But if you start writing on either an addendum and you got a lot of stuff, or even on the request of repairs, then it will attach the text overflow addendum, which is a supplement to the addendum or any of the documents that you need extra space as well. So those are some of the distinguishes regarding different addendums and amendments as well. So when to use the addendum versus the Aea form, right? An addendum is an open-ended offer that can be accepted anytime prior to its written withdrawal. Okay, well, what does that mean? You know, what's your take on this, Steve, when they say prior to its written withdrawal?
Well, at that point, you know, it's open-ended, referring to, you know, at that point, we whoever is the maker of, you know, of that addendum, like, let's use the example, buyer's request is making a request to the seller based on loan approval is taking longer than anticipated. And so plain and simple, we know based on the calendar and based on the time frame lender is giving that there is no way we're going to close escrow on time. We're not even going to have loan approval based on the timetable that we're not even going to have loan approval even by the time close of the originally scheduled close of escrow date. So plain and simple, buyer is now requesting upon seller, would you grant a 2-week escrow extension?
Right.
Okay. In which then we got a verbal, okay, via the emails, the agent texted seller said yes, and the whole bit. Let's memorialize it now in the addendum, okay, open-ended, and it doesn't really have the date yet, okay, it's not really required. Once signed, it then goes to the escrow company to extend that escrow, but as time gets closer to the original close of escrow date, that addendum is not signed by that seller, then it really does need to be retracted.
Right.
All right, and then put on the AEA, okay?
Right.
Now it's like, okay, we now need a deadline, okay, we need an answer. Because now it also will have bearing on whether or not I remove my loan contingency within the contract or not. Okay, so, you know, overall, there's probably not a lot of times once in escrow that it's date sensitive, but it's very, you know, case specific based on the set of circumstances of why the change is being requested. Okay, I'm gonna say, if I had to take a guess, 90% of the time, you probably won't need the AEA.
Correct.
Okay,
Right.
most of the time.
Yeah, you're spot on that. Thank you so much, Steve, for sharing. Yeah, as he was stating, the difference in the distinguishes, obviously, you know, the addendum is an open-ended offer. But you can also do modifications prior to someone withdrawing, right? Basically rescinding, not accepting, or you know, declining. Then you can utilize the form to add, you know, additional terms to it to put perspective in, you know, the wishes of the buyer or the seller as well. An amendment is intended to be used after a contract has already been created and one party suggests a modification of the binding agreement. The AEA is a proposal and expires if not accepted. So basically, the difference between an open-ended agreement, right? There's no expiration date, right? This can carry on and you're like, you know, we haven't got a response, we haven't got anything, right? But when you have an expiration on there, at least you know that by Thursday at 5 p.m., you either get a yay or nay on it, we'll know where we stand. So good information to know. Here's an example, request for repairs, right? As we were talking, Steve, the RR is issued after an offer has been accepted, typically during the buyer's investigation period, right? Obviously, there is contingencies in place. There's, you know, protection for the buyer, but also protection for the seller, right? What if the seller has a contingency in place that I will not sell my property, right? Until I can identify open escrow or even possibly close on my upleg or my second home. So the seller has stipulations to protect the seller's interest from selling the property to possibly your buyer. They have a contingency in place that also the buyer may force the seller to either release that as part of the condition, or the buyer has the right to back out. No difference than a buyer having those contingencies, right? Which is usually disclosures, physical inspections, appraisal, and loan contingency, right? Once the buyer releases all contingencies, now the buyer's deposit is in jeopardy, right? It's exposed. And if the buyer cannot perform, either because cannot obtain the loan, something happens, change, you know, so many things could occur. Then if the buyer breaches the contract, then ultimately the seller may have rights to some, if not all, of the deposit that's in escrow, right? Depending again on what those parameters are, right? If the buyer is buying the property for the sake of moving in, or if they're buying it as an investment. And we've also seen in these agreements where a buyer puts more than 3% of the deposit into escrow. Now you're not just exposing up to 3%, but if the buyer is not buying for the intent to live in the property, more as an investment, now you're probably jeopardizing even more. Obviously, the price point also definitely impacts the amount of deposit, right? So there's many variables in how you can utilize this, but part of that request of repairs, it allows the buyer specific instructions to be given to the listing agent and also the seller. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we are requesting X, Y, and Z. Well, we're asking for the AC to be repaired, right? Or replaced. We're also asking for maybe a credit in lieu of the repairs, or we're asking maybe a price reduction. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, you know, after looking at all the parameters and inspections we've done, we came to a conclusion that maybe a price reduction would be necessary for us to move forward. And those are all three of the parameters that a buyer can request. 1, 2, or 3, or all three, right, Steve? They can ask for all three. They can ask for fix this, give me credit, and also I want a price reduction. And again, it's again, the give and take, right? The back and forth. This is where your skill sets and your ability to negotiate the win-win, right? It's that tug of war sometimes. And you may come across these scenarios where you try to navigate. That's why it's very important that from the very beginning, you're in constant communications with the opposing agent to build rapport, build dialogue, and ultimately be on the same page, because the ultimate goal here is for the buyer to get the property, the seller to sell the property, and for both agents to get paid a commission, right? That's the ultimate goal. But it's, again, how you navigate the process and understanding the dynamics of all these contracts that we have in front of us too, as well, right? Because now from an experienced, very diverse real estate professional who knows and understands these documents will be able to really anchor, but more so articulate the conversation, because the answers are there, right? Why we use this form, why we use that form, why do we have this paragraph, right? No difference than what legal and attorneys do. They dissect these forms and come to a concise approach and how to navigate these conversations, and who's wrong, who's right, or anything different. Anything to add, Steve, to that?
No, I mean, that's exactly it. You got to be precise. More than I'm sitting here thinking about it, the reality is the this new Aea form is a good form. However, the reality, you almost even still stuck with an addendum, and within the term of the addendum, if you want to put in a deadline date, it would accomplish the same thing. Okay. The change is subject to response by the opposing party, no longer, no later than X date and time.
Absolutely.
But most of the time when we use addendums, technically speaking, it really is a thing to memorialize something that has already been pre-discussed and pre-agreed to. Okay. Dealing with a request for repair, like, all right, we're going to give $1 credit of X amount of dollars, and it's going to be reflective as though it's going to be used for closing costs. Okay. And so it was done via the phone communication, it was done via email communication. All parties were on the same page. Now let's just memorialize it on an official addendum.
Right.
Because if it also then required $1 credit going from seller to buyer, if it required a price reduction from seller to buyer, before the escrow company will put it on their official amendment, they need to see it on an addendum.
Absolutely.
So although I think it's good to know and understand about this new form, okay, of the addendum form, I would probably first almost focus, anytime you really have changes, think really almost more addendum, more so than the AEA, whatever that abbreviation is. Okay. And I think it'll just be cleaner to almost think of it that way.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Steve. Well, the request of repair, which is the CAR form RR, the R is issued after an offer has been accepted, typically during the buyer's investigation period, right? Remember, all properties are sold in as-is condition, meaning that the seller doesn't have to do any repairs, doesn't have to do any price reduction, and more so doesn't have to give the buyer any type of credit or concessions, okay? But it's giving some wiggle room too, right? And allowing the process to continue. This is why sometimes the seller's been a little bit to help navigate this, because this is where we see most, if not all, of the cancellation is during the physical inspection period. Remember, the contract already stipulates what, 17 days, right, Steve?
That's the default.
That's the default, 17 days. Especially during this time, right? So the 17-day is the default to buy for the buyer to do any and all inspections, meaning they can do home inspections, sewer inspections, electrical, roof, chimney, foundation, any and all those inspections, and then some, right? To satisfy the buyer's overall condition of the property, and allow the buyer the opportunity to say, look, I'm still willing to be in the game and still sell, and still continue with the process of closing this. But this electrical is a big concern. It's about an $8,000 price. I'm already putting a down payment, closing costs, and my mortgage payment is going to be this. I'm asking in good faith, if the seller is willing to either give us the credit or, actual repairs. Now, again, I've seen different types of scenarios here. In my personal opinion, it's best to just give the credit and have the buyer be responsible after close of escrow, because then you have the concern, getting a licensed contractor, right? Maybe possibly getting the city involved, right? So there's many variables when it comes to the seller doing those. And what if, the buyer is not completely satisfied? Now you get the call after the deal closes, right? And now saying, hey, this was not done by code. I mean, there's so many things. So you got to be very, very careful in how you approach this part of the process to get to the finish line. But the request of repairs is there for that purpose. And before, they didn't have the expiration, which is paragraph number 5, which now gives the buyer and the seller a time period, right? Which buyer proposes this request of repairs, which shall be deemed revoked unless by 5 p.m. on the 3rd day of this signed agreement. Now it puts the seller on notice. Hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we need to respond to this ASAP. Let me know if you're going to give us what's called now the RRRR, which is the seller response to the buyer's request of repairs, right? So that way we know where we stand. Otherwise, we're going to retract. We may send another request, which will now be request number 2, or the buyer just decides to cancel. And I've seen it from personal experience and dealing with some of the agents too during this phase, as I mentioned earlier, where we see a lot of cancellations because there's not a meeting of the mind between the buyer and the seller. And that's where we end up going a different direction, cancel. But here's the big picture, or what I call the cherry on top. And I know Steve can probably testify here. Your job is to navigate and make sense of all this, right? Take the emotional out of it, because sometimes what I see a lot is agents get so entangled in the emotional aspect of it. Take it out, stay focused on the business perspective, and finish it in the long haul to try to push the buyer, try to push the seller to meet an agreement. So that way you're not starting over, the seller's not starting over, because this uncertainty, right? You're already in escrow.
Take we out of your dialogue.
Thank you.
Communicating with your clients.
Right.
Okay, and especially if the response that is given by the opposing party is not one that you would like to see for your client, but, and especially then, more so than at any other time, if you are personally upset with the response and you use the word we as though that counter or request is being made upon you personally, your client picks up on that we and that emotion, and they latch onto it. And our job as real estate professionals is to have our clients focus on the issue or issues at hand, and for us to really have them focus on the bullseye, the meat and potatoes, not all the frills, especially dealing with the request for repairs. And I agree, Simon, that is the area where I think most transactions blow up because of the emotion that's behind it. If agents understood how to appropriately negotiate, right, and part of that all starts with communication, both with your client and the other agent out there, right, to get them on the same page. Okay, it all starts with that. That's a whole class of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. All right, some examples here: an extension of time addendum, right? What's better known as the ETA. When is the ETA utilized? And it is an addendum, right? The ETA has a pre-printed language to extend escrow or give a buyer more time to remove a contingency. Since it is an addendum, it has no expiration date. The ETA is often used after a buyer and seller have verbally agreed to stated terms in a quick response to a commonplace. But if the recipient does not sign quickly, the sender should consider withdrawing withdrawing it in writing and then making the proposed on the Aea form. Back in December, this year, in December of 2022, the ETA is scheduled to become an amendment with the expiration date, just like the Aea form. So that's going to be interesting that now they're going to include an expiration on it.
No, that seems very appropriate because
Sure.
now they're talking about true time extensions. That's the ETA form is all about, extension of time, whether it be investing in contingency removal or close of escrow.
Right.
We have to have a time sensitivity already built in onto that.
Yeah.
Because it has ramifications if not signed.
Absolutely. So here's, really just kind of a recap and really get a concise sense as to where we stand and the importance of understanding all these different agreements, right? Because it can be confusing. There's so many different addendums. It's like, which one do we use, right? Well, the best approach, and Steve Colley can testify to this, is you've got to go in there and start reading these documents, right? Understanding some of these, taking advantage of classes like this and really getting your hands and really getting deep into getting your hands a little bit dirty, right? That's the way you're going to understand, comprehend, but also understand when and how and time frame to utilize these agreements. The extension of time is a very crucial form that was created back, I think, in 2006. We didn't have an extension prior to 2006. And this is a blessing in disguise. The reason is it allows the buyer, it allows the seller that extra time to extend. And it can be extend of escrow, right? If it's a 30-day escrow, right? And it looks like we're going to be tight on closing, it doesn't look like we're going to close in 30 days or sooner, then you as the buyer and the buyer's agent need to be proactive and get that extension of time. Don't wait till the last minute. Be proactive, be engaged in communications and explain, right? Get the lender involved if it's a reason or purpose that it's a lender issue, right? Last minute, something is missing and it's going to take a couple of days or even weeks to get, right? We've been in those scenarios. So being proactive in your engagement as the process is going, if you need that extension of time to close, then send out the ETA form. The other one, right, which is the one that is pressed upon us, right, is the loan contingency, right? Everyone hates to pull that one out at the very last minute. Now the contract says, right, that the buyer is responsible of releasing the loan contingency in 17 days. Just a year or 2 years ago, the contract was 21 days to release loan contingency, and they retracted that. Now it's 17 days, which 17 days.
Still active removal though.
Correct.
Years ago, we had what was called passive removal.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Right.
We no longer, in which actually the buyer had the choice, buyer and seller had the choice to make it either active or passive.
Right.
Which then
Automatically.
Buyer's agents always chose active, listing agents always came back to passive, and finally the RPA was just eliminated, changed it, and just made it all active.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, as Steve says, actively means you have to include the CR form, the contingency removal. That's the active aspect of it, because we've had litigations over, passive and active. Now, to my surprise, we still have that in commercial, where they still use language of, passive, meaning that it will automatically be released.
Silence is deemed approval.
Yep. Yeah. Not in the real estate residential realm of it. So we still need to get the the CR form, the contingency removal. Just to add to this, let me see, the ETA is often used for buyer and sellers have verbal agreement to start stated terms and a quick respond in commonplace. As I said, you know, the aspect of it, if you look at it, there's three or actually four, right? There is the extension of escrow, the extension of contingency, other extensions, and then any additional terms as part of this, and then the buyer and the seller will have to execute this in order. So let's just say, theoretically speaking, if you as the buyer's agent requesting the seller and the listing agent for an extension to release loan contingency, right? Because the contract says that even the seller and the listing agent can send you the CR 2 days prior to the 17 days. So they can send it to you on the 15th day, the CR, and then by the 17th day, you have to release it. Otherwise, the notice to perform is given. And that notice to perform is what, 48 hours to respond. To respond to the notice to release that as a condition. Otherwise, the seller would have the right to cancel and, you know, put the property back on the market.
For clarification, the notice to perform can be sent out 48 hours.
Correct.
Or two days prior to the expiration, which then means on the 15th day, it can be issued on the 17th, at the end of that 17th day, if the contingency has not been released, it now allows that party who issued the contingency removal form to then cancel. Doesn't mean they will, it just gives them the contractual right that they now can.
100%. Yep, absolutely. So this is why you got to follow your timelines. And that's important, especially when you're navigating and representing the buyer, because the buyer is the one that's releasing the most of the contingencies. And what it's telling the seller is, hey, in good faith, we're continuing. In good faith, you know, we want this property. This is the reason we have these layer of contingencies, right? And if there is uncertainty or you're not getting the answer, then I would encourage you to send out this extension of time. Why? Because it allows you more time. This is where you need to be in communications with the lender, right? Hey, you know what, Mr. or Mrs. Lender, you know, the 17th day is in a couple days. I need to know where we stand. Is the buyer approved? Can we release? You know, that is a condition. And most, if not all, lenders will say, well, you know, it's not my decision. And it's not. It's really the buyer's decision to either pull the plug in releasing that, no one else. Because I've heard it, and probably you too, Steve, the buyer will come back to you, well, Steve, what would you do in my case, right?
Yeah, of course.
Well, what's your response to that, Steve?
Well, my advice always is, we need to talk to your lender, okay? We need to talk to the loan officer to find out what issue or issues are still outstanding that what they are waiting for or are needing in order to make a reliable decision. And if it's only a matter of some documentation that you say is forthcoming, let's say verification of employment from your employer, because you work for a major employer, and it took forever for that VOE to come in, and you know that the information is correct, you know, that the income stated is what is going to show on there, and it's just a matter of the formality. And you need to weigh the situation of how much pressure are you guys getting from the listing side to cancel or not, okay? And so, you know, if you're getting the pressure, okay, of having to remove the contingency, or that seller is going to cancel,
Right.
and yet you are and then if you're kind of nervous, is that it's not just only some general paperwork, but you're on the fence. It can go either way from the underwriter's decision. You know, I mean, it truly is a coin flip. I know, you know, typically I would say I'm not willing to risk my money on a coin flip.
Right.
But even if it's not a coin flip, then I would say I would do it, okay, if I were in your shoes, if that's how I truly felt. but understand, I cannot make that decision for you.
Right.
I will not make that decision for you.
Right.
Okay, you need to do it, if you're on good faith, only on the basis that we can't get an extension. And that is why, though, when you're a good buyer's agent, if it's only a formality of paper waiting, you need to be on the phone with the other listing agent to be able to say, look, I know you want the contingency removal. Okay, your seller wants that contingency removal. It strictly is a formality. Okay, allow the buyer another few more days, because even if you were to cancel, okay, you're going to be starting from square one again with new buyer, rather than just waiting a few more days with our buyer.
Sure.
Okay.
Right.
And that's always how you have to play it. Where is your client going to be if in fact they end up canceling, rather than playing ball with our buyer, who I feel is still going to be in good shape. But I never, ever, ever, ever end up saying to my buyer, oh yeah, you should take the chance.
Yeah.
Okay, not with their money,
Exactly, not with their money, solid point there, Steve. Yeah, because remember, some of these price points and the deposits are huge, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60,000, even 100,000. Well, yeah, I mean, 5,000, 10,000, it doesn't matter. What I'm saying is, you're not going to jeopardize your clients, because the first thing, if all this goes sideways, they're going to be pointing fingers. Well, you told me, Simon, you said to release this. You said it was okay. And I've seen where agents write checks. I remember one 10 years ago where the agent unfortunately advised the seller to release without thoroughly speaking with the lender, and the lender completely wasn't able to go through with the loan. The buyer unfortunately didn't qualify. And, and thank goodness it was a small deposit, but it was still a check that the agent ended up, signing off for $5,000.
The escrow on top of that, then.
Yeah, exactly. So, just keep that in mind. It's not your job. It's up to the principals to tell us what to do. And if they throw that at you, just as Steve said, then, you can always bounce it back. Look, I'm not the one making your mortgage payment. I'm not the one responsible for living in the property. You got to tell me what direction, and whatever direction you want to go, I'm perfectly fine. The emotional aspect is for me to just do what you are asking me to do. And that's it. And if that's asking for an extension, hey, you know what? Roll up your sleeves, have that heart-to-heart conversation with the listing agent and say, look, what are the pros and cons? We're 15, 20, 22 days in escrow, right? Does it make sense for us to cancel, right? And you're going to have some agents out there that will constantly threaten, right? Well, if your buyers don't release, we're going to cancel. If the buyers don't remove, we're going to cancel. Okay, well, go ahead and cancel, because they got to start all over again, right? They got to put the property back on the market, fish for another buyer to come in. And still, there's no guarantee that the new buyer is going to perform or close. They still got to go through their due diligence period, right? Doing their inspections and then putting a request. So that's the way I see it. And most seasoned, experienced agents see it the same way. It's better to fight for your clients and hang in there, but also be professional, right? Between the two agents. And if you need that time, hey, I'm requesting that extension of time. Yes, sir.
And the advice then goes, when you're the listing agent being requested upon to have the seller give the extension of time. Again, it most likely will behoove your seller. But one of the things that you should do as a good listing agent before giving the nod to your seller is get on the horn with that buyer's lender, with that loan rep, okay, to be able to get the information straight from the horse's mouth, not the buyer's agent, of what the lender said. Talk to the actual loan officer themselves, and to be able to see if it matches up, and does it actually warrant the extension Or is it, because the loan rep is typically not gonna blow smoke. They can't afford to be able to blow smoke.
Sure.
And so, and again, at that point, it gives you more credence when talking to your seller. Look, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, you know, for another week, we're still gonna be further ahead, even if we end up losing the week.
Right.
Okay, then starting over, and then trying to get another buyer, having additional set of inspection issues.
Right.
Because again, you know, you bring in 5 different inspections, you're gonna get 5 different inspection results.
Right.
Okay, and so it's really important also as a good listing agent to be able to know that, yeah, sometimes just adding, you know, taking a little bit more time, especially in this market.
Right.
Okay, when this market is not such a robust market, you know.
So true.
Buying works on everybody's favor typically if everybody's trying to get the train, you know, from station A to station B.
Yeah, 100%. And just to add to what Steve was saying is, you know, the market has definitely pivot, right? Where 9-10 months ago, it was a seller's market, right? Multiple offers above asking, buyers releasing any and all contingencies just to get their offer accepted. Well, now the buyers have a little bit of control. And we're not seeing as many offers on the table. And it all depends on the area, right? Price points, because that'll dictate, you know, if you're going to get, you know, 5 to 10 offers or 1 offer or 0 offers, right? So in essence, you know, now the cards have turned around where now the buyer and the buyer's agent have a little bit of control. Now the buyers can, you know, request certain terms and conditions. And I've seen, you know, substantial price, you know, as part of the caveat to get their offer accepted. That's just the way it is. Now, obviously, you need the cooperations of all parties, right, to make this go forward. But that's where you come in as the professional to navigate that, you know, that conversation and make it a win-win for all parties. Now, with that being said, you know, the understanding of the process. I mean, we can talk hours and hours and hours just on this particular topic, you know, the do's and don'ts, the risk involved, and, you know, some horror stories as well of agents getting entangled and not really being concise and transparent with their clients, and hopes that, you know, we're going to cross our fingers that everything plans out, and sometimes it doesn't. This is why it's best to just lay it out thick, right? And just explain here's the good, here's the bad, and here's the ugly scenario. You tell me what you want, where your feel is the most risk that you're willing to take. And if that risk is too high for you, then maybe this is not the right property as well. So there's a lot of elements to that. Again, as a professional, your goal is just to listen to your clients' wishes and then go with that. You can sleep better at night, right? And more so, you know, if it's not meant to be, it's not meant to be. It just, for me, no commission is worth it, right? When it comes to a liability. So again, I know I threw a lot at you. Thank you, Steve. You're awesome for, you know, always chiming in and adding to it. Any other questions regarding, you know, the differences between an addendum and an amendment that you'd like to ask? Okay, no questions. All right, I guess I was very thorough in this presentation. So I really, really, really appreciate it. And guess what? An hour. We got it done in an hour. So yeah, just this small presentation can sometimes go a long way. But I appreciate you all. Thank you very much for sticking around. And if you have any questions, by all means, please reach out, send me an email, call me, text me. I'll be more than happy to help navigate any of your questions. All right. Thank you. And we'll talk soon. Take care.